All right, let's talk about Russia.
Do we have
Russia, Russia, James. Russia is what we heard for 3.5 years there. Russia was responsible for my asthma, I think, last year. And probably when you got the flu too. And you know this stuff as well as anyone, and you were actually working with the people who were on the other side of this, both sides of this. Yeah, you're kind of unique in a way. I don't know of anybody else who's kind of worked with both sides of this. Um, what what is it about Russia that drives the Clinton and Obama and Biden people and the Michelle Flournoy people and the Blinken people completely nuts? And what is it? Why does it drive them crazy? And what do they want ultimately to do about Russia, do you think? This is the
okay?
question.
I think that in terms of the sort of Russia hysteria, it reached sort of McCarthyite levels after the election, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know why, right? So they look. Obviously, there was some level of interference, right? Not to the point of vote
Sure.
count changes and all that stuff,
Sure.
but all that stuff. It's absolutely credible that they were on doing social media stuff and fine. Even if that hadn't happened, right? So if Hillary had won the
Mm-hmm.
election, there would be this wouldn't have happened. The hysteria of 3 or 4 years and stuff like that. That would have just been swept under the rug, and it would have been a minor story, as it should have been, given the levels of interference of other countries, which we touched upon earlier. So even if Trump hadn't won, we would still be in a very bad place with Russia. And I think that this goes back to a sort of disillusionment stemming from the failure of America to remake Russia in its image when in the 1990s. So that project went awry. I mean, it went seriously awry. The Clinton administration made enormous efforts to prop up Boris Yeltsin, make Russia into an American-style capitalist economy. And they really, in the end, backed the wrong horse. Mr. Yeltsin was an incompetent. He was a serious alcoholic. He had other health problems. He was extremely corrupt. And all those hopes that went into remaking Russia in America's image with Yeltsin at the head came crashing down. And it was Yeltsin, of course, who appointed Vladimir Putin to become his successor, right? And I think that there's a sense of they're not really blaming the right person. All the blame goes to Vladimir Putin for Russia's trajectory, but really they ought to be blaming the guy who they themselves backed. So I think there's a psychological element in it, and they can't really come to grips with the fact that they themselves are responsible for what's happened in the ensuing years. When Putin first came on the scene, there was some hope even among the hardest line Russophobes in government at the time that he would be a breath of fresh air. Madeleine Albright, right, who is a Democratic hawk, dismissed what she called all this psychobabble about Vladimir Putin and the KGB,
Wow.
right? And really, that's what it is. He was a not particularly high-ranking case officer in East Germany, right? He's not some sort of spy mastermind. No, or at least he wasn't in early in his career, right? So there was some hope there, but he was going to chart his own way, and he had to get the economy under control. He had to get the oligarchs under control. He had to rebuild Russia's defenses, and there were points at which he was rather anxious to cooperate with the Americans. Now, this is 20 years ago, right? He was the first world leader to call George W. W. Bush after 9/11. Later on, the Russians were instrumental in helping the United States establish the Northern Distribution Network, through which we would send cargo. It was an air corridor, cargo and troops to Afghanistan, right? But the problem is that, the Russians were, like the French and Germans, were very outspoken against the Iraq War. We ignored them, right? And they were very outspoken against the idea, now this is some years later, against the idea of overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya. We ignored them, right? Syria, we find ourselves on opposite sides. And so, and then finally in Ukraine, again, opposite sides. The driver of a lot of this stuff, though, is our project of NATO expansion.
Right.
The Russians were too weak to do anything about the first wave of expansion in the 90s. And I don't think that they wouldn't have been able to do much about that anyway. There's no reason, if we were going to continue the alliance, there was no reason not to bring in Poland, for instance, right? But the expansion project kept creeping up closer and closer and closer and closer to their border. And that is naturally going to alarm any competent leader, right? And so once it became clear that we were going to start to try to get some of their some of their closest allies, some of their that were former republics of the Soviet Union, to bring them into the mix, that was a red line for them. And so, they even they didn't make too much noise, I don't think, when Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania came in. But it's a different ballgame when we started to talk about Ukraine and Georgia. The problem with this project of NATO expansion, is my much missed friend and mentor used to say all the time, Steve Cohen, is that in the first Cold War, the epicenter of the division was in Berlin. Now it's in Kyiv. And so it gets closer and closer and closer to Russia's border. Now we have, both sides doing military exercises right on top of one another. We have, constant, interactions in the air over the Baltic Sea. We're face to face. We're face to face in Syria. We're face to face in the Black Sea. It's an extraordinarily dangerous situation. And so the problem is that we've been blinded by our own good intentions, I think. So how could the Russians possibly object to a defensive alliance? It's just a defensive alliance. That's what we're told. But you can't possibly look at the record and say that's what it is, right? So it seems to me to stem from a lack of empathy, but also a lack of strategic sense. I don't know why. I don't know who they think they're making safer by expanding the alliance right up to Russia's border. So that's sort of my long-winded answer to your question.